Grace, mercy, and peace to you from God our Father and our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen. Well, you know, some days you walk out and you say, thank you, Pastor, you gave me something to really think about, you know. And last week I think was one of those. This week will be one of those. But it started with an experience I had where somebody gave me something to really think about. It was at least 15 years ago, maybe longer. In our district, New Jersey district where I grew up, they offered classes on Saturdays for lay people to go to. It was really nice. They had all sorts of different doctrine and Bible classes and things that were a part of a Leaders and Learners curriculum they had. I don't know if they still do it, but it was nice that they did that. And I guess Jersey's small enough that you could just have it in one place and people could come out on Saturday. You know, up here it's a little more spread out. But there's one class, I can't remember which class it was or how we got on the topic. We started to talk about poverty and poor people. And the pastor who was leading it brought up this one verse. It's actually half of a verse. It's not even all of verse 7 in Mark 14. And in the NIV, which is the Bible that most of us were using back then for Bible study, the translation said, the poor you will always have with you. The poor you will always have with you. And the way I understood it as he was discussing this was that we didn't have to feel really obligated to do anything for the poor because Jesus prophesied that they'd always be there. Like, no matter what we did, they're still going to be there. And I thought, wait a minute, that doesn't really click with what I think I know. And it led me to doing my own study on this because I just couldn't believe that that's what Jesus would have meant by that phrase, that the poor you will always have with you. That, it's like shoveling snow in a blizzard, you know, that, well, it just keeps piling up anyway, so why would we do that? So I looked at it and did a little word study on it, and, you know, if you look at the ESV that we use more commonly today, a little more literal, it says, Jesus said, you always have the poor with you, talking to his disciples. And really kind of more just a plain literal translation, the poor are always with you, right? And, well, that's kind of a known fact, you know, at least back then, the poor were always going to be there. Why would he bring that up? And this is out of context. We talked about this on Wednesday, right? Take things out of context and you kind of lose part of the message too. He wasn't really talking about the poor. They were talking about this lady who had shown up at dinner and done something nice for him. In Mark 14, when Jesus was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, as he was reclining at table, a woman came with an alabaster flask of ointment of pure nard, very costly, and she broke the flask and poured it over his head. There were some who said to themselves indignantly, why was that ointment wasted like that? For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor. So they're showing actual compassion for the poor, right? And Jesus is the one who says, because they're scolding her, and Jesus said, leave her alone, why do you trouble her? She's done a beautiful thing to me, for you always have the poor with you, and whenever you want, you can do good for them. But you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for burial. So the first thing you notice is a prophecy at the end, right? He's leading them up to what's coming, and this woman, maybe not unwittingly, was using a type of ointment that they would have used even for a body being buried, but a very expensive, the best one you could ever use. And also saying that his time is limited, that she was doing something special in recognition that this was a limited time he was going to be there, and the most precious thing she had was going to go to him. So it didn't really have a lot to do with our view of the poor. It had to do with how they were understanding Jesus and his mission and his brief time with them. But it still leaves us wondering, well, what do we do about poverty? Poverty is still 2,000 years later. In fact, it's probably more complicated of an issue than it was back then. And certainly there are people out there that have little compassion for those who are struggling. But I would suggest that most people, even non-Christians, feel obligated to do something, want to do something. But again, it's a bit like shoveling snow in a blizzard, right? It seems like we barely make a dent. What do we do? What are we supposed to do? How did we get in this situation to begin with? And that might be a good place to start, is how did we get into a situation where we have so many people who are struggling? I mean, back in most of the biblical times, when you talked about poverty, it was first of all having lack of food, which is a problem. And then it might be a lack of clothing, lack of a place to stay. But that was kind of it. Today it's more complicated than that, but just that little bit, though, just having something to eat could be a problem. Now, in the beginning of time, there was no such problem, right? Why? Because God provided everything. Adam and Eve didn't have to garden. They didn't have to do anything to make the cows give milk. Nothing. They just went out and God provided everything they needed. That was his joy. That's what he wanted to be doing for us right now. That we just enjoy. It's like when you go to somebody's house and they just love to cook and you say, no, you stay in your seat. I'll take care of everything. That was God, right? Giving them everything they needed. And then when they sinned, when sin was introduced, we said not only did it destroy the relationship between them and God and each other, but it also corrupted all of creation. And that's why we have earthquakes and tornadoes and even droughts, right? And so there are natural causes to famine. Lack of rain, especially for thousands of years before we had a lot of fancy irrigation. If the rains didn't come, people went hungry. And they struggled in those situations. They prayed to God to change this. We were out in California a few years ago during the middle of that horrible drought, and not only was it dry, but it was incredibly hot. It was 100+ degrees everywhere we went except for San Francisco. It wasn't as humid as it is here, but it was hot, and what did God in his mercy this year brought rain. A little more than they wanted maybe, but he brought rain, right? And he does that. Things are cyclical that way. But we saw even in the Bible, right, the time of Jacob and his 12 sons, Joseph ends up in Egypt, and the rest of the family ends up there because of a drought and the famine that ensued. But through a dream given to the Pharaoh, Joseph was able to get them positioned for it, store a lot of food, and his family came from the land of Canaan, and they were saved from the famine. There was mercy shown to his family, and it was God's plan. But that was probably the main struggle they had for a long time. But interestingly enough, though, also in that time, you see going on in Egypt, something that was kind of new. It was this sort of a class system, right? You had now this Pharaoh. Now the people had kings that would just protect them, but this is a guy who, he amassed wealth for him, great wealth for himself, and he had the people that were closest to him. He had the military, and they were taken care of, and then he had everybody else. And they had slaves now, right? They enslaved all of the Israelites. And they had the basic needs for daily life if they worked, right? If they produced the bricks and stuff they had to do. They had food, they had basic shelter, they had some possessions. But they didn't have the freedom to do much beyond that. And you fast forward a few hundred years, you get to about 900 AD, and now we have in Western Europe the feudal system. You have an emperor, perhaps, you have a king, and under the king come the aristocrats, the aristocracy, the lords they called them. And one of the things that made them the rich aristocracy is they owned the land. You think, well, how did that happen? Because, at the time of Adam and Eve, of Noah and his children, nobody owned the land. They just settled in places. They didn't buy it from somebody else. But at some point, somebody said, this is mine. And then often by force, they'd say, that's mine too, and that's mine too, and that's mine too. And so land was owned by people. The people who owned it then could say, hey, I don't feel like working the land. I'll get you guys to work it for me. And by the time of the feudal system now, boy, everybody owned something. You couldn't just say, I'm going to settle here. No, it belonged to somebody. And if you wanted to eat, you worked the farm, and part of the proceeds went to the owner, and you got a little bit for yourself. And so you had the king who had a lot, you had the aristocracy who had almost as much, and then you had the knights or the military, right? Because they had to protect the kingdom and make sure we could keep our wealth. And so they did pretty well, and then you had everybody else. You had the serfs and the peasants who just eked out a living. And that's where we start to see real poverty start to happen, because it depended on the benevolence of the king and the aristocracy. How much do they have compassion for these people? And it snowballed from there, right? It's just snowballed to the day that we have now, where we have, most societies around the world have some kind of a class system. Maybe not with the king anymore, but we still have those at the top who have a lot, and those at the middle who are kind of doing it right, and those at the bottom that struggle in different ways. It's very complex. And the needs today are different too. It's not just food and shelter and clothing. Well, if you want to survive today, you have to have a cell phone, probably internet access. You need to get to a doctor, you need medicine, right? All of this stuff costs money. And when we try to help, it's like we're barely making a dent. And sometimes we're frustrated. Sometimes if you've worked with people who are homeless in particular, sometimes you realize that sometimes they're their own worst enemy, right? I know folks personally that the main reason they're in the situation they're in is because of alcohol abuse or drug abuse. One guy in particular, I love him dearly. He's sleeping in the woods because he's got family here. But they're all fed up dealing with his addictions. And so you're trying to help them to deal with their own issues that's stopping them from being in poverty, right? And the truth is that God did create us when we're young and able to work, to do things, to survive on our own, right? It says several places in the Bible, Paul wrote in 2 Thessalonians, and this is actually part of a counseling to this church, but he said, if anyone's not willing to work, let him not eat, right? If you're young and healthy, you do it. We have a responsibility to do things, to work, to be able to provide for ourselves and our family. In Proverbs it says, lazy people refuse to work are only killing themselves. All they do is think about what they would like to have. The righteous, however, can give and give generously. So not only do the righteous work, but they are given abundance to be able to help others. So there's a responsibility to take care of yourself, and then a responsibility to help those who need help. And traditionally in the Bible, who were those who were often singled out who needed that help? It was, young children, of course, right? The widows who had lost their main support, the elderly who could no longer do the work in the fields and whatever that they did before, and of course, people with disabilities, right? Often when you see stories in the gospel about someone who was begging, they were blind or something else, right? These are the folks that needed help, and the ones that were instructed to help. So at the other extreme, though, we have the people who have abundant resources, right? The ones in the Bible they call the rich or the wealthy. And in Matthew 19, Jesus said to his disciples, truly I say to you, only with difficulty will the rich person enter the kingdom of heaven. Again, I tell you, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven. And that is daunting words, and first of all, we often envision that camel and the needle, and you'd have to make it into really small pieces to get it through that needle, right? Jesus says, not impossible. With God, all things are possible, but it is great difficulty. One of the difficulties is because when you have abundance, you have to ask yourself, how much is enough? How much is too much? What do I do with the abundance, with the excess? How do I best manage it? Do I kind of keep it and parcel it out, or do I just give it all away in one day because there are people in need? Am I asking myself if I have too much, right? It's rough spiritually to be in that position. And in fact, if you think way back to just after the flood, we talked about this last time, they spread out on the earth and they find places to live, and they all have the same thing. They all have what they need. They have a place to live. They're growing things to eat. If everybody has the same, there was no need to use the word wealthy. They might have even had a word that said rich or wealthy back then, because it's a comparative thing, isn't it? It compares people and says, well, these people have great abundance, so we'll call them wealthy. And these people have very little in comparison. And so today we have that same struggle of saying, wow, we do see a great disparity. And then we start to ask ourselves as disciples of Jesus, well, is that me or is that somebody else? And usually we like to think of somebody else, right? Everybody can find somebody else who has more assets than they do. The unluckiest person on the whole planet is the guy on the cover of Forbes magazine that says, richest man in the world. Well, you got no one else to point to, right? You can have a few $1 billion and say, oh, he's the rich guy. I'm just kind of middle of the road, right? And most of us who are considered middle class, we can point to everybody else. Oh, they're rich. We're just this. But then I think about people I've known who think we're rich. Remember, we got, just before Y2K, remember that? We had ton of computer work to do, and we couldn't hire enough people to do the work. And so we had some guys that were providing temporary contractors from India, and I'd have to interview them on the phone to see if they're going to work out. And one guy lived in a small town. They had one phone in his neighborhood. It wasn't in his house. So I had to arrange ahead of time to have him at the neighbor's house to talk to him. And he did come over, and when he came over, he says, "Oh, you Americans are so rich. In India, if I had a car, they'd think I'm the coolest guy around. And every one of you has a car. That's so great." They were amazed by that, just owning a car. And it could be a junky car, too, he said. It didn't have to be that great. Just having a car was so cool. And a lot of us, we have 2 cars. We have a 3-4 bedroom house. Down here you have a swimming pool and a sprinkler system that doesn't work, right? And we think that we're struggling. And these people are like, "Man, you have everything. You have how many doctors in this town if you get sick?" There are people that go several towns over to go to a doctor, right? We think in comparison, because it's always comparative, that wealth is somebody else, and comparing to us, they're going, "We're wealthy." Society is so complex, we don't even know what we have. We don't even know if we've got it good or we don't have it good. But there's always somebody doing worse off than us too, right? People who really genuinely struggle. Sometimes because of their own fault, sometimes they contribute to it by making things worse, doing things they can't afford to do. And there's folks who they find no way out. They're trying to save their family, and the jobs that they can do just don't pay well, or they disappear. The Bible talks a lot throughout Old Testament gospel epistles about our attitude towards folks who are struggling, right? The people in poverty. Isaiah, and this is trying to counsel the people who've been off in the Babylonian exile before they come back. What's going to happen? And these are folks who are thinking, they didn't do the right thing. That's why God had allowed this to happen. But the thought process is, how do we cross our T's and dot the I's and do things just the right way so God's happy with us and he won't let this happen again, right? And so first of all, they're going to do the ashes on the forehead, and they're going to fast, and they're going to get together and do all this stuff, and then make God happy. And God says, and these are some pretty tough, direct words here. He's like, that's all fine, but it's not what I'm looking for from you all. The kind of fasting I want is this: remove the chains of oppression and the yoke of injustice, and let the oppressed go free. Share your food with the hungry, and open your homes to the homeless poor. Give clothes to those who have nothing to wear, and do not refuse to help your own relatives. Then my favor will shine on you like the morning sun, and your wounds will be quickly healed. I will always be with you to save you. My presence will protect you on every side. When you pray, I will answer you. When you call to me, I will respond. It's about having compassion for the people around us, right? He goes, that's what he's looking, and isn't that what he's always been looking for? Compassion on the people around us. We've said almost every week, I think we reiterated the great commandment: love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as you love yourself. That's what he's saying right there. That's what he's looking for. Be my people. Live like my people. Love people like I love you. And it's funny because these are guys that are coming out of this Babylonian exile, and he's telling them to stop oppressing people. And they're like, no, we're oppressed. He's like, yeah, listen. And you take advantage of somebody else. Or you have little pity on them. Or they say they'll work for $1 when the going rate is 10, you'll give them $1 anyway because that's what they asked for, and that's fine. Why not? He's saying, have compassion. Treat them like you would treat yourself. And then I'll respond to you. How many times you hear in this country Christians saying, oh, we're under God's judgment because of all of this sin going on. And the solution is, get all these people to stop sinning and then God will like us again. And he never says that. He says, no, I want you to have compassion on other people. Forget what they're doing. You're my children. Have compassion on everybody else. It's not the answer we expected or we're looking for, right? Nowhere in the Bible does he say, get all those other people who are not part of my kingdom to stop sinning, right? He doesn't say that. He's telling what we're supposed to do. Jesus in Matthew chapter 25 talked about this. We just read it in the gospel before, right? The first part, it says, the king will say to those in his right, and this is the judgment, right? He's talking about what's going to happen at the end times. Prepare yourselves for this event, and it's going to go like this. The king, who's him, Jesus, will say to those in his right, come, you who are blessed by my Father. Inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. Get what he's been planning for you from day one, what you were going to get from Adam and Eve's time. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, you came to me. All of this good stuff. And the righteous say, oh, we don't remember doing that. Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And he says, because of the way you treated these, the least of my brothers, it was like you did it to me. So not only is it obvious it's important to Jesus because he teaches this, but he says this is important for how I'm going to look at you at the judgment. Did you have compassion or not? Now, this isn't the only story that Jesus tells that's a little troubling, because we all know and we teach faithfully all the time that we are going to be welcomed into heaven. We will be saved by our faith in Jesus, right? We're saved by grace, God's grace. He loved us. He forgives us for no reason other than he loves us. We have faith in that, and then we are saved because Jesus died for us, and we are covered by his righteousness, right? But then it sounds like a works thing, right? And it's Jesus saying, do this stuff. And so it kind of confuses Lutherans. They go, but we know we're saved by faith. And this is where it ties in with what James said, and I think it explains it very well. He says, what good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith up here, but does not have works? In other words, there's no living out of that faith. Can that faith save him? If a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking in daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, be warmed and filled, without giving them the things needed for the body, what good is that? So also, faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. In other words, if you say, yeah, I know this, and I believe it, and I think it, and your life doesn't describe that, your life doesn't show it, your life doesn't change because of it, your life isn't affected by what you supposedly think and believe, what do you got going on? What do we have if we could say all this great stuff, but it doesn't affect our lives? It doesn't affect our compassion. It's not reflected in the things that we do and say. Because that kind of faith, he says, is dead. It's another way of saying, maybe you don't really have the faith you think you have. Maybe we got to stop and regroup, because we say we believe all this stuff, we like to love stuff, but we just struggle doing it, right? Now, it doesn't mean that we're losers, by the way. This is part of the good news of the gospel, is that, remember Jesus said the Spirit's going to help us, right? We all start out baby steps. You know, we're all sinful and worthless, right? Sinners are worthless, but he's making us into something of worth, of value. He says, I'm the tree, right? I'm the trunk, you're the branches. You can't do anything good apart from me, but I can start to transform you. And you're transformed how? By hearing the word, letting it dwell in you, grow in your heart, and then acting on it, right? That we have a desire to see our lives start to follow in his footsteps. He says, if you want to follow me, what do? Take up your cross, follow my footsteps. And he wants you to do that, right? So he's going to strengthen us to do that. It's not like a litmus test that says, oh, you failed, you know, you're not going to do it. But it's a wake-up call to us if we say, yeah, you're right, I say I believe this, but I've not really been walking the walk here, right? I think that James works perfectly in explaining what Jesus is talking about. Jesus is looking to see that there's action. You know, you can say, I believe, but faith is what? It's belief plus trust, right? I trust him, so I'm going to do what he said. Even when it doesn't make sense to me, or even when I think this is difficult, or even if it seems counterintuitive, that this is what Jesus is telling me. Well, okay, you know what you're talking about, right? That's what we do. And just show me your faith apart from your works. You know, faith with no work. And I will show you my faith by my works, right? You'll know what it is that is near and dear to my heart just by what you see me doing. And again, what does it tie into? A lot of it just keeps going back to the compassion for people, caring for their basic needs. Not just seeing people suffer and go, well, that's too bad. But you know what? We're overwhelmed too, aren't we? We are really overwhelmed. Because there is so much poverty out there. Again, some of it's caused by drought and famine. There's certain places, particularly in the northern part of Africa, where it seems like it's a cycle. They're okay for a while, then all of a sudden there's the drought. They're starving. We're sending all kinds of stuff. We were just a few weeks ago, several of us went over to the Catholic church there, and we're doing, what was that called again? Feed My Starving People. And they have a great plan. You're bagging this whole thing that's got, if you mix it up and cook it together, you have full nutrition for like the whole day. And you could be doing crates and crates and crates of these, and the people still be hungry because there's so much famine there. And I think we're overwhelmed when we think about that. And even in our own country, it's like poverty takes on a different look, right? Some of these neighborhoods are in bad shape. Flint, Michigan, was it, with the water's hardly drinkable for these kids? What do we do? We're overwhelmed. What do we do? Maybe what Jesus really is just looking for, and you think about the directiveness of the language, and even from James, who's the person he put in your life this week right in front of you that needs help, right? Starting right there. It doesn't mean we forget the people across the world. It's like our ministry, right? We focused a lot on the souls of the people right here, but we're also making sure that something's happening across the world, right? That we have missionaries in different places to help get things going, that training's going on, that people are being fed somehow. But on a daily basis, I'm ministering to the people that are in my life, the people in my neighborhood, the people I work with, right? And this sort of compassion for people struggling in poverty can work the same way. We have some organized programs here, right? We have at least two places that we're helping to feed people who are struggling. One is down at Messiah Lutheran, right? We've got, in fact, through the Bootstrap program that they're collecting things for now that helps that organization. There's another group in Centennial Park that feeds folks at 5 o'clock on Sundays. We've been there a few times. You just cook something, tray of something, bring it there, and you'll feed folks. And it's not just homeless, it's folks who are just having a hard time making ends meet come out and eat there. And then there's the people you just see, that you know, that you say, oh, wow, what can I do to help this one person? If everybody helped just one person, do you think we could solve a lot of these issues? Probably, right? Then it doesn't seem so impossible. But it's also paying attention and seeing them. Not because sometimes they say we feel invisible, right? People look through us. We're not there. God will give us abundance if we're going to bless others with it, don't you think so? And he proves he does that. Will we ever solve that issue before Jesus returns? Probably not. It's like everything else. Sin stands in the way of making this place perfect utopia. It won't be that way. But Jesus said, I'm going to do that part, right? When I return, right after that judgment he talked about, what happens? Everything's renewed. Everything's restored. Everything's wonderful. And it'll be back to like it was in the Garden of Eden, where God's like that great relative who says, you sit down, take it a load off your feet. I'm cooking. And I'll do the cleanup, right? And we'll say, oh, no, let us help, please. And I'll say, no, sit down. Say, no, let us help, please. And we'll just be having such a great time. There won't be any more poverty. There won't be all these things to stress about. But he will be so thrilled at the way that we did look out for each other before that day. And it will reveal who he is and his true character to the people that we have compassion on. And so it's in Jesus' precious name that we all say, Amen.